After his billionaire dad, who everyone thought despised him, died, his wife divorced him to marry his high school rival, leaving him with nothing but his father's disappointment and a broken heart. But what he discovered in a dilapidated storage unit using a rusted key his father secretly slipped him on his deathbed would turn the tables in a way none of them saw coming. What happened next will make you question everything you think you know about fake loyalty, corporate greed, hidden legacies, and the expensive price of underestimating a disowned son. Viewers, before we dive into this incredible story of Vindication, do me a huge favor. If you love stories about justice, instant karma, and watching greedy people get what they deserve, hit that subscribe button right now. Seriously, you do not want to miss the showroom confrontation coming up. Drop a like on this video, it actually helps more than you think, and comment below telling me where you're watching from. Are you in Lagos, New York, London? I want to know. Now, let's get into this story because the level of betrayal here is absolutely brutal. The sterile rhythm of the heart monitor was the only thing filling the silence in the VIP suite at St. Jude's Medical Center. It was a rhythmic, mechanical countdown that James Putman had been dreading for weeks. Outside, the city of Seattle was battered by a relentless downpour, the gray sky mirroring the gloom that had settled deep in Stephen's chest. He sat in a rigid, uncomfortable chair beside the bed, his eyes red-rimmed and heavy, watching the chest of the man who had cast a shadow over his entire life rise and fall in shallow, ragged breaths. James Putman, the billionaire titan of industry, looked small in the hospital bed. The man who had crushed competitors and built an empire from nothing was now reduced to wires, tubes, and the pale, papery skin of the dying. Stephen reached out, his hand hovering over his father's, desperate for a final moment of connection, a singular sign that he wasn't the disappointment the tabloids painted him to be. The door swished open, breaking the spell. A nurse bustled in, checking the IV drips with efficient, practiced indifference. James's eyes fluttered open, the steel-gray irises instantly locking onto his son. The vulnerability vanished, replaced by the familiar, cold sneer that Stephen knew so well. "Stop hovering, boy," James rasped, his voice weak but laced with the old venom. He pulled his hand away from Stephen's reach as if he were swatting away a fly. "You look pathetic. Sit up straight. It's embarrassing." Stephen flinched, retreating into his chair. "I just wanted to make sure you were comfortable, Dad." "Comfortable?" James scoffed, coughing dryly. He glanced at the nurse, ensuring he had an audience. "I'd be comfortable if my legacy wasn't being left to a soft-hearted fool who can't even manage his own checkbook, let alone a corporation." The nurse offered a sympathetic, pitying glance toward Stephen before finishing her chart notes. "I'll give you two some privacy, Mr. Putman. Dr. Eris will be in shortly." As the door clicked shut, the atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. The disdain that had hardened James's face melted away, replaced by a look of fierce, desperate urgency. The transformation was so sudden that Stephen blinked, wondering if he was hallucinating from lack of sleep. James reached out, his grip surprisingly iron-clawed for a dying man, and seized Stephen's wrist, pulling him close. "Listen to me," James hissed, his voice dropping to a barely audible whisper. "We don't have much time, Stephen. The walls have ears, Stephen. They always have ears." "Dad, what are you—" "Shut up and listen." James's eyes darted to the door, then back to his son. With a trembling hand, he reached under the heavy medical blanket and pressed a cold, metallic object into Stephen's palm. Stephen looked down. It was a key, old, rusted, and heavy, the kind that belonged to a door that hadn't been opened in decades. It looked nothing like the sleek digital keycards that accessed the Putman skyscrapers. "The old workshop," James whispered, the effort costing him precious breath. "On the edge of the shipyard. Unit 4B. The code is 1985. Do you hear me? 1985. Stephen stared at the key, confused. "The workshop? Dad, that place was condemned years ago. What are you talking about?" "It's the only place they don't know about," James said, his breath hitching. He squeezed Stephen's hand, his nails digging into the skin. The lawyers, the board, they're vultures, Stephen. They've been waiting for me to die so they can pick the carcass clean, but they aren't the worst of it. James's gaze drifted to the framed photo on the bedside table, a picture of Stephen and Shirley taken at a gala the year before. James's eyes narrowed. "Don't trust her," James choked out. "Shirley? Dad, she's been organizing everything. She's devastated." "She's a snake," James growled, a spasm of pain crossing his face. "I saw the way she looked at the portfolio when she thought I was asleep. She's not here for you, son. She never was. She's waiting for the payout." "You're wrong," Stephen whispered, though a cold knot of dread began to tighten in his stomach. "She loves me." "Prove me wrong then," James wheezed, his strength rapidly fading. "Go to the workshop before the will is read. Do not let anyone see that key, not the lawyers, and especially not your wife." The heart monitor began to beep faster, in erratic, frantic tempo. James slumped back against the pillows, his grip on Stephen's wrist loosening. The cruel mask threatened to return, but for a split second, James looked at his son with something that resembled pride, or perhaps hope. "I had to be hard on you, to make you tough enough for what's coming. Don't let them win, Stephen. Burn them all." "Dad?" Stephen leaned in, panic rising in his throat. "Dad!" But James Putman was already gone. The heart monitor flatlined, a long, high-pitched tone that signaled the end of an era. Stephen sat frozen, the sound screaming in his ears. He looked down at his hand. The rusted key was warm from his father's grip, a heavy, jagged piece of metal that felt less like an inheritance and more like a weapon. Footsteps approached the door outside, the heavy, polished shoes of lawyers and the sharp click of high heels. Stephen quickly shoved the key into the deepest pocket of his jeans, wiping his eyes just as the door flew open. He turned to face the vultures, the heavy secret weight against his thigh the only thing anchoring him to the ground. The funeral of James Putman was less a memorial service and more a corporate merger of grief and opulence. It was held at the Cathedral of St. Mark, a towering Gothic structure that had been rented out exclusively for the afternoon, ensuring that the weeping of the common man didn't interfere with the mourning of the elite. Outside, the paparazzi swarmed like locusts, their camera flashes cutting through the drizzle that had persisted since James's death 3 days prior. Stephen stood at the edge of the open grave, the wet grass sinking beneath his dress shoes. He felt numb, a hollowness carved out inside him that had nothing to do with the cold wind. He looked around at the sea of black umbrellas. There were senators, tech moguls, and rivals his father had spent decades trying to bankrupt, all wearing solemn masks of respect that didn't quite reach their eyes. They weren't here to mourn James Putman. They were here to make sure the old lion was truly dead. Beside him, Shirley adjusted her veil. It was a delicate, custom-made piece of lace that cost more than Stephen's first car. She sniffled audibly, a sound that seemed perfectly timed for the shutter clicks of the press pool cordoned off 50 yards away. Stephen reached out to take her hand, seeking a modicum of comfort, but her fingers were stiff and unyielding. "Don't squeeze so hard," she hissed under her breath, not turning her head. "You're wrinkling the gloves, and fix your tie. You look like a mess, Stephen. The cameras are on the left." Stephen dropped her hand, the rejection stinging more than the cold. "My father just died, Shirley. I don't care about the cameras." "Well, you should," she snapped, finally glancing at him with eyes that were dry and sharp. "Appearance is everything. James knew that. It's a shame you never learned it." She turned back to the crowd, her posture shifting instantly into one of graceful, tragic bereavement as a photographer leaned in for a closer shot. Stephen felt a surge of nausea. He jammed his hands into his coat pockets, his fingers brushing against the cold, jagged metal of the rusted key he had carried with him since the hospital. It was the only real thing in a world of plastic and pretense. The service dragged on, a parade of eulogies given by men who barely knew James, speaking of his vision and generosity, words that would have made the old man laugh in their faces. As the coffin was finally lowered, the crowd began to disperse towards the reception tent, a sprawling canvas pavilion filled with champagne and hors d'oeuvres. Stephen lingered by the grave, watching the dirt settle. He wasn't ready to face the condolences, the fake sympathy, the probing questions about the future of Putman Industries. He wanted to scream, to tell them all to leave, but he knew he had to play the part. As he finally turned towards the tent, a flash of movement caught his eye near the parked limousines. It was Shirley. She hadn't gone to the reception line. She was standing in the shadow of a large oak tree, the collar of her trench coat turned up against the wind. But she wasn't alone. Leaning close to her was Arthur Finch, the family's longtime attorney, a man with a smile like a shark and a reputation to match. And standing with them, looking entirely too comfortable, was Carter Thorne. Stephen stiffened. Carter Thorne was his high school nemesis, the golden boy who had always been everything Stephen wasn't, charismatic, ruthless, and undeniably favored by the corporate world. Carter had clawed his way onto the Putman board of directors 3 years ago, a move James had surprisingly allowed, citing the need for sharks in the tank. Stephen stepped behind a marble angel, watching them. The interaction didn't look like a condolence offering. Shirley was animated, her hand gesturing sharply as she spoke to Finch. Carter was nodding, a smirk playing on his lips that looked dangerously like satisfaction. At one point, Carter reached out and placed a hand on Shirley's shoulder. Not a pat of comfort, but a squeeze of familiarity. Shirley didn't pull away. She leaned into it. The warning from the hospital bed echoed in Stephen's mind. The walls have ears. Don't trust her. He watched as Finch handed Shirley a thick manila envelope. She took it quickly, slipping it into her designer handbag with the practiced ease of someone used to hiding things. They exchanged a few more words, heads bowed together in a tight circle of conspiracy before breaking apart. Carter laughed, a short, sharp sound that carried over the wind, and then smoothed his tie, walking towards the reception tent with the stride of a man who had won a victory. Stephen's heart hammered against his ribs. The grief was rapidly being replaced by a cold, burning suspicion. His father hadn't just been a paranoid old man ranting on the deathbed. He had seen this coming. Taking a deep breath, Stephen stepped out from behind the monument. He waited until Carter and Finch had disappeared into the crowd before he made his move. He walked towards the tent, his hand tightening around the rusted key in his pocket until the metal edges bit into his skin. The sadness was gone. In its place was a singular, clarifying thought. He was walking into a den of lions, and he was the only one who knew he held the key to the cage. The reading of the last will and testament of James Putman took place in the grand library of the family estate, a room designed to make anyone who entered it feel small. The walls were lined with mahogany shelves filled with books that had never been read, and the air smelled of lemon polish and old money. A massive portrait of James hung above the fireplace, his painted eyes staring down in perpetual judgment at the gathering below. Stephen sat at the far end of the long oak table, isolated. To his right sat Shirley, her posture rigid, her fingers drumming a silent, agitated rhythm on the leather armrest of her chair. Across from them sat the board of directors, a row of dark suits and predatory smiles, with Carter Thorne positioned directly in the center, looking less like a mourner and more like a man waiting for a coronation. Arthur Finch, the lawyer, stood at the head of the table. He cleared his throat, a dry, scratching sound that cut through the murmurs of the room. He adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and cracked the seal on the thick document before him. "We are gathered here to execute the final wishes of James Edward Putman," Finch began, his voice devoid of emotion. "James was a man of precision, and his instructions are explicit." Finch began to read. The early sections were standard: bequests to the housekeeping staff, donations to the local art museum, a surprising sum left to the medical center that had treated him. The board members shifted in their seats, checking their watches. They weren't here for the appetizers, they were here for the main course, the controlling interest of Putman Industries. To the Putman Family Trust, which controls the majority shareholder voting rights in the entirety of the real estate portfolio. The room held its breath. Stephen felt Shirley stiffen beside him. To 100% control to the board of directors, to be managed under the stewardship of the current executive committee. A collective exhale of relief swept through the suits. Carter Thorne didn't smile, but he leaned back, tenting his fingers in a gesture of absolute satisfaction. He had won. The empire was theirs. And finally, Finch said, his voice dropping an octave, to my only son, Stephen Putman. The silence that followed was suffocating. All eyes turned to Stephen. He sat up straighter, bracing himself. He didn't expect the company. He knew his father thought him too soft for that. But surely there would be a trust, a safety net, something to acknowledge their blood relation. Finch hesitated, glancing at the paper and then at Stephen with a look that might have been pity had the man been capable of it. I, James Putman, being of sound mind, leave to my son the sum of $1. The words hung in the air, heavy and absurd. A nervous tittering broke out from the back of the room where the junior associate stood. Shirley gasped, her hand flying to her mouth, though she couldn't tell if it was shock or humiliation. $1? Stephen repeated, his voice sounding hollow in the cavernous room. That's a mistake. It is no mistake, Finch said coldly. There is an addendum, a personal note James wished to be read aloud in the event of your attendance. Finch lifted a separate sheet of paper. It reads, To Stephen, I give you the only thing you have ever truly earned. Nothing. You have lived a life of comfort without sweat and status without struggle. I leave you this single dollar as a seed. If you are truly a Putman, you will grow it. If you are not, it is more than you deserve. Consider this my final lesson in self-reliance. The silence shattered. It started with a snort from Carter Thorne, a harsh, barking laugh that he didn't bother to suppress. It acted as a permission slip for the rest of the room. The board members chuckled, shaking their heads as they gathered their papers. The humiliation wasn't just financial. It was a public evisceration. His father hadn't just disinherited him. He had set up a final show to strip him of his dignity in front of the very people who had always looked down on him. Self-reliance, Carter drawled, standing up and buttoning his jacket. He looked at Stephen with eyes full of mockery. Well, Steve, don't spend it all in one place. Inflation is a killer these days. The room erupted in low laughter. It was the sound of a pack turning on the wounded member. Stephen felt the blood rush to his face, a burning heat that pricked at his skin. He looked at Shirley, desperate for an ally, for someone to stand up and say this was cruel, this was wrong. But Shirley wasn't looking at him. She was staring straight ahead, her face pale, her jaw clenched so tight a muscle feathered in her cheek. She was visibly shrinking away from him, creating a physical gap between their chairs as if his poverty was contagious. Shirley? Stephen whispered. She stood up abruptly, the legs of her chair screeching against the parquet floor. I need fresh air, she said, her voice brittle. She didn't wait for him. She walked briskly toward the exit, passing Carter Thorne, who gave her a nod that was far too knowing. Stephen sat alone at the table as the room emptied. The board members filed out, chatting about stock prices and lunch reservations, stepping around him as if he were a piece of discarded furniture. Finch closed the folder with a definitive snap and looked at Stephen. I will have to check for $1 mailed to your residence, Mr. Putman, Finch said dryly, unless you prefer cash. Go to hell, Finch, Stephen muttered. I believe I'm already on the payroll, Finch replied smoothly, before turning his back and walking away. Stephen remained in the chair, the echo of the laughter still bouncing off the walls. He reached into his pocket, his fingers finding the jagged edge of the rusted key. Nothing, his father had said. I leave you nothing. But he had left him the key. Stephen closed his eyes, the humiliation burning like acid in his gut. They thought he was finished. They thought he was a joke. He squeezed the key until it hurt, grounding himself in the pain. Let them laugh. Let them take the skyscrapers and the bank accounts. He had the one thing they didn't know existed. And as the sound of the heavy library doors closing sealed him in silence, Stephen realized that the lesson in self-reliance was about to begin in earnest. The drive back to the penthouse was a study in suffocating silence. The limousine, usually a cocoon of luxury, felt like a hearse transporting two corpses, one dead, one wishing he was. Rain lashed against the tinted windows, blurring the city lights of Seattle into streaks of gray and charcoal. Stephen sat on one side of the leather bench, watching the back of the driver's head, while Shirley sat as far away as possible, scrolling furiously on her phone, the blue light illuminating a face twisted in calculation. When the elevator doors slid open directly into their foyer, the dam broke. Shirley didn't wait for the doors to close. She stormed into the living room, tearing the lace veil from her hair and throwing it onto the floor as if it were contaminated. She kicked off her heels, one hitting the imported Italian wall with a dull thud. "Unbelievable," she seethed, pacing the expanse of the white marble floor. "Absolutely unbelievable. $1, a single godforsaken dollar." Stephen stepped out of the elevator, loosening his tie. He felt exhausted, his bones aching with the weight of the day's humiliation. "Shirley, please, not now. I can't." "Not now?" She spun around, her eyes blazing with a fury he had never seen before. The carefully curated mask of the supportive, doting wife had vanished, leaving behind something sharp and predatory. "When, Stephen? When should we discuss the fact that you just dragged me through the mud in front of the entire city? Do you have any idea how I looked back there? Do you have any idea what they are texting about me right now?" "They're laughing at me," Stephen said quietly, walking toward the wet bar to pour a drink. His hands were shaking. "I'm the one he disowned. I'm the one he hated. And I'm the one who married the loser," she screamed, the sound echoing off the high ceilings. Stephen froze, the crystal decanter hovering over the glass. He slowly turned to face her. "What did you say?" Shirley stopped pacing. She took a deep breath, smoothing her dress, her demeanor shifting from hot rage to icy pragmatism. It was terrifyingly sudden. She walked over to the sofa and sat down, crossing her legs, looking at him not with love or even pity, but with the cold appraisal of a banker looking at a bad investment. "Let's stop pretending, Stephen. It's exhausting." Her voice was steady, conversational. "I didn't marry you because you were charming. You're quiet, you're brooding, and frankly, you're boring. I married you because you were the heir to the Putman fortune. I invested 5 years of my life, my prime years, waiting for the old man to kick the bucket so we could live the life I deserve." Stephen felt the room spin. The words hit him harder than the reading of the will. You invested in me?" "I bet on a sure thing," she corrected, inspecting her manicure. "Or what I thought was a sure thing. Everyone knew James was hard on you, but fathers always leave it to the sons in the end. It's how the world works. But you," she laughed, a dry, humorless sound, "you managed to be such a disappointment that he broke the oldest rule in the book. He didn't just cut you off, he burned the bridge and pissed on the ashes." "I thought you loved me," Stephen whispered. It sounded childish even to his own ears, a naive plea from a life that no longer existed. "I loved the potential, Stephen. I loved the security," she said, standing up and walking toward the window to look out at the skyline she felt she was owed. "But let's be realistic. You have no money. You have no job because, let's face it, your consulting position at the firm was charity from your father. And now you have no status. You are a social pariah, a joke." She turned back to him, her face hard. "I need security, Stephen. I need a man who can provide a legacy, not a man who gets left a dollar bill in a lecture." "So that's it?" Stephen asked, his voice hardening. The shock was beginning to wear off, replaced by the dull ache of the truth his father tried to warn him about. The walls have ears. Don't trust her. James knew. He knew all along. 5 years of marriage and you're done because the check bounced? "I'm done because the transaction is void," she said coldly. "I want a divorce, immediately. I've already spoken to Arthur Finch. He's drawing up the papers." "Finch?" Stephen narrowed his eyes. "You were talking to him at the funeral, and Carter." "Carter is a man who knows what he wants and takes it. He's on the board. He's the future. You are the past." She walked past him toward the hallway leading to the master bedroom. "I'll be staying in the guest suite tonight. I expect you to be gone by morning. The lease on this place is in the company's name, and as of today, you have no association with the company. Carter says the eviction notice is a formality, but I'd rather not have security drag you out." "You're kicking me out?" "I'm distancing myself from a failure," she corrected, pausing at the doorway. She looked back at him one last time, her expression devoid of any warmth.
Don't make this difficult, Stephen. You have nothing. No money for lawyers, no friends on the board. Just sign the papers when they come and disappear. Go find a nice, cheap apartment in the suburbs and pretend none of this ever happened. She slammed the bedroom door. The sound was final, like a gunshot. Stephen stood alone in the dark living room, the glass of scotch still untouched in his hand. The silence of the penthouse was no longer suffocating. It was clarifying. He looked around at the expensive furniture, the art on the walls, the life he thought he had built. It was all smoke. It had never been his. He reached into his pocket. The rusted key was still there. It was cold, jagged, and real. I give you the only thing you have ever truly earned. Nothing. His father's voice echoed in his mind, but this time it didn't sound like an insult. It sounded like a challenge. Shirley thought he was finished. Carter thought he was a joke. They saw a man with nothing. Stephen downed the scotch in one burn, slamming the glass onto the counter. He wasn't going to the suburbs. He wasn't going to disappear. He walked to the foyer, grabbed his coat, and pressed the button for the elevator. He had a storage unit to find, and for the first time in his life, he had absolutely nothing left to lose.
3 nights in a Mercedes-Benz E-Class sounds like a luxury to anyone who hasn't tried it. In reality, it was a torture chamber of leather and cramped angles. Stephen woke with a gasp, his neck seized in a knot of pain, the windows fogged over with the condensation of his own breath. Outside, the relentless Seattle rain drummed against the roof, a rhythmic reminder that the world was still wet, gray, and indifferent to his downfall. He sat up, peeling his cheek off the cold leather of the steering wheel. His suit, the one he'd worn to the funeral, the one that cost $3,000, was wrinkled and smelled of stale sweat. He rubbed his eyes, the grit of exhaustion scratching against his corneas. He was parked in the back lot of a 24-hour diner near the airport, hidden between a dumpster and a delivery truck. It was the only place he could think of where the paparazzi wouldn't look for the son of James Putman. He checked his phone. Dead. He hadn't bothered to turn it on since leaving the penthouse, knowing it would just be a flood of Google alerts announcing his humiliation to the world. Billionaire son disowned, wife files for divorce, the $1 heir. He had $40 in his wallet and a quarter tank of gas. That was the sum total of his life's assets. Stephen stared out at the rain-slicked asphalt. Panic, cold and sharp, began to crawl up his throat. He should be calling lawyers. He should be begging friends for a couch to crash on. But he knew, with a clarity that cut through the fog of sleep, that no one would answer. Shirley had been right about one thing. His friends were friends of the fortune, not the man. His hand drifted to his pocket, his fingers brushing the jagged metal of the rusted key. It was the only thing that felt real. Unit 4B, the edge of the shipyard, 1985. His father's rasping voice replayed in his mind, louder than the rain. It was a fool's errand. James Putman had been hallucinating, vindictive, or both. Why would a man who lived in penthouses and flew private jets keep a storage unit in the slums of the industrial district? It was probably full of old tax returns or broken furniture, trash he was too sentimental to throw away, but too proud to keep in the house. But Stephen had nowhere else to go. He turned the key in the ignition. The engine purred to life, the fuel light blinking an angry orange warning. He put the car in gear and pulled out of the lot, heading south, away from the glass towers of downtown and toward the shadowy sprawl of the shipyards. The drive was a descent into the city's past. The manicured streets gave way to potholed roads lined with chain-link fences and warehouses that had been shuttered since the 90s. The smell of the ocean here wasn't the fresh, salty breeze of the marina. It was the heavy chemical stench of diesel, rust, and stagnant water. He found the address after 40 minutes of circling a maze of unlit streets. It wasn't a commercial storage facility with bright orange doors and security cameras. It was a desolate row of corrugated iron structures backing up against the dark water of the Sound, surrounded by a fence topped with razor wire that looked like it hadn't been replaced since the Cold War. A faded sign creaked in the wind.
South End Industrial, private property. Stephen killed the engine. The silence here was heavy, broken only by the distant clang of a buoy bell out in the harbor. He stepped out of the car, the rain instantly soaking through his dress shirt. He shivered, pulling his jacket tighter, and walked toward the pedestrian gate. There was a heavy electronic keypad mounted on a rusted post, its buttons worn down by years of use. Stephen hesitated. 1985. He punched in the numbers, 1985. A heavy mechanical clunk echoed from inside the mechanism, followed by a green light that flickered weakly. The gate buzzed. Stephen pushed it open, the hinges screaming in protest. He walked down the row of units, his dress shoes splashing in puddles of oily water. The place felt like a graveyard for industry. Unit 1, Unit 2, Unit 3. He stopped in front of Unit 4B. It was larger than the others, more of a small warehouse than a storage locker. The corrugated metal was painted a peeling industrial gray. There was no electronic lock here, just a heavy iron door with a single ancient keyhole. Stephen's heart hammered against his ribs. He pulled the rusted key from his pocket. It looked too old, too primitive for anything important. His hand shook as he slid the key into the lock. It met resistance, years of grit and disuse, but he pushed harder, wiggling it until he felt the pins align. With a grunt of effort, he turned it. Click. The sound was incredibly loud in the quiet night. Stephen grabbed the handle and heaved. The door groaned, dragging against the concrete floor before swinging inward, revealing a cavern of absolute darkness. The smell hit him first, not the musty scent of rot he expected, but the sharp, distinct aroma of machine oil, sawdust, and ozone. It smelled like work. He fumbled for his phone, cursing when he remembered it was dead. He potted his pockets, finding a silver Zippo lighter he'd swiped from the penthouse bar, a habit he'd picked up to annoy Shirley, who hated the smell of butane. He flicked it open, the small flame dancing in the draft. He stepped inside, holding the light high. The flickering glow illuminated a space that was frozen in time. It wasn't a storage unit filled with boxes. It was a workshop. In the center of the room sat a massive drafting table covered in blueprints that had yellowed with age. Along the walls were shelves stacked with prototypes, clunky metal gears, engine parts, and models of ships that Stephen vaguely recognized from old company photos. This was where it had started. This was the garage where James Putman had built his first engine, the patent that had launched a global empire. But why send him here? To show him where he came from? To rub his nose in the grit he lacked? Stephen moved deeper into the room, the shadows stretching long and distorted against the walls. He walked to the drafting table. On top of the dusty blueprints sat a single modern object that looked entirely out of place, a heavy black steel safe. It was brand new, its digital interface gleaming in the gloom. Stephen stared at it. The contrast between the ancient rusted workshop and the high-tech steel was jarring. He ran his hand over the cold steel. There was no keyhole on this one, just a biometric scanner and a keypad. He looked around the room, feeling the weight of his father's presence. James had sent him here for this, not for nostalgia, not for a history lesson, for this box. Stephen checked the keypad. It required a 6-digit code. 1985 was only 4 digits. Damn it, Stephen whispered, the sound swallowed by the vastness of the workshop. He tried the code anyway. 198500. Error. 001985. Error. He slumped against the table, the adrenaline crashing into fatigue. He was wet, cold, homeless, and locked out of the final puzzle. He looked at the blueprints beneath the safe. They were drawings of a turbine engine, dated October 14, 1985. Stephen froze. He stared at the date, October 14th. His birthday was October 14th. He was born in 1985. A chill that had nothing to do with the rain swept over him. The code wasn't just a year, it was him. His father hadn't used the company's founding date or a stock price. He'd used Stephen's birth date. Trembling, Stephen reached out to the keypad. 101485. The safe let out a soft, melodious chime. The heavy bolts retracted with a solid thud, and the door popped open an inch. Stephen held his breath. He hooked the finger around the edge of the door and pulled it open. Inside, there were no stacks of cash, no gold bars. There was only a thick leather binder and a stack of bearer bonds bound in rubber bands. He reached in and pulled out the binder. He opened it to the first page. It wasn't a will, it was a deed of trust. The Phoenix Holding Group. Stephen frowned. He'd never heard of it. He flipped the page, his eyes scanning the legal jargon, the subsidiaries, the asset lists. As he read, his breath caught in his throat. His eyes widened, scanning faster and faster, the lighter flame flickering dangerously close to the paper. Phoenix Holding owned the patents. All of them. The engine designs, the software algorithms, the logistics trademarks. Putman Industries, the massive corporation the board had just stolen, the company Shirley had left him for, was merely an operating company. They leased the technology. They didn't own it. This workshop, this worthless shed, owned the intellectual property of the entire empire, and the sole beneficiary of the Phoenix Trust, listed in black and white at the bottom of the page, was Stephen James Putman. Stephen stared at the paper, his hands shaking so hard the lighter snapped shut, plunging him back into darkness. But he didn't need the light anymore. He stood there in the dark, the smell of his father's first workshop filling his lungs, and for the first time in his life, he didn't feel like a disappointment. He felt dangerous.
The darkness of the workshop felt different now. It wasn't the emptiness of a tomb, but the heavy, pregnant silence of a vault. Stephen flicked the Zippo again, the flames sputtering against the draft. He couldn't read the future of the Putman Empire by the light of a cigarette lighter. He fumbled his way along the wall, his hand brushing against cold metal shelves until his fingers found a breaker box. He threw the heavy switch. With a loud thwack and a hum of rising voltage, a row of industrial overhead lights flickered to life. They were dim, caked in decades of dust, casting a sickly yellow glow over the concrete floor, but they were enough. Stephen turned back to the safe. Now illuminated, the contents looked even more incongruous against the backdrop of the rusted shop. He pulled the heavy leather binder out completely and laid it on the dusty drafting table, sweeping aside the old blueprints. Next to it, he stacked the brick of bearer bonds, untraceable immediate cash that his father had likely stashed away before the digital age took over. He thumbed the corner of the stock. It was easily $2 million, enough to survive, enough to hire a lawyer who didn't play golf with Carter Thorne. But the money was a distraction. The real weapon was the binder. Stephen opened it again, his heart rate settling into a cold, rhythmic thrum. He began to read, his eyes scanning the dense legal vernacular that he had spent years studying in business school, the very education his father had mocked him for. The Phoenix Holding Group. He turned to the Assets tab. Listed there were not buildings or trucks, but patent numbers, hundreds of them. U.S. Patent 89042214, high-efficiency turbine propulsion. U.S. Patent 9100500023, deep-sea logistical algorithms. Trademark registration, the Putman logo and brand identity. Stephen flipped to the corporate structure chart. It was a simple, brutal diagram. At the top sat Phoenix Holding Group. Below it, connected by a dotted line labeled Exclusive Licensing Agreement, was Putman Industries. Stephen sat back, the creaky stool groaning under his weight. He ran a hand through his wet hair, a laugh bubbling up in his chest, a jagged, hysterical sound. "You old bastard," he whispered, looking up at the ceiling. "You magnificent, paranoid bastard." The world, Shirley, the board, the press, thought Putman Industries was the empire. They looked at the skyscrapers, the shipping fleets, the factories, and they saw power. But his father had pulled a sleight of hand that would make a magician blush. He had separated the body from the soul. Putman Industries, the company the board had just clawed control of, was a shell. It owned the physical assets, the depreciating trucks, the aging buildings, the overhead. But Phoenix Holding, this dusty, forgotten workshop entity, owned the mind of the company. It owns the designs the factories built. It owned the software the ships used to navigate. It even owned the name painted on the side of the building. Stephen turned to the master licensing agreement. He scans the clauses until he found Article 14, Termination. This license is granted in perpetuity to Putman Industries, revocable immediately upon the event of a change of control of the licensee, or at the sole discretion of the licensor, Phoenix Holding Group, with 30 days written notice. Stephen stared at the words until they blurred. Revocable immediately. The moment James Putman died, the control of the company had shifted to the board. That was a change of control. The license was technically already voidable. The board members, Carter, the Sharks, the Visionaries, were currently popping champagne in a boardroom they didn't really control. They were captains of a ship that didn't own its own engine. If Stephen wanted to, he could legally order them to stop using the Putman name, stop manufacturing the turbines, and stop using the software within 30 days. He could shut down a multi-billion-dollar operation with a single cease and desist letter. He wasn't the disowned son. He was the landlord, and they were tenants who hadn't paid rent in a very long time. Stephen looked around the workshop with new eyes. The peeling paint and the rusted tools weren't signs of decay, they were camouflage. His father had known that men like Carter Thorne only looked at the surface. They looked for the glitz, the marble floors, the quarterly earnings reports. They would never think to look in a condemned shipyard for the crown jewels. And the disappointment, the public shaming, the $1, it was all part of the security system. James had to make Stephen look worthless. He had to convince the world that Stephen was so incompetent, so unloved, and so removed from the business that no one, not even Shirley, would bother to dig into his assets. If James had left him a trust fund or a seat on the board, they would have scrutinized everything. They would have found Phoenix. By destroying Stephen's reputation, James had protected his inheritance. A wave of emotion hit Stephen. Grief, finally, but mixed with a fierce, burning gratitude. His father hadn't hated him. He had trusted him with the ultimate test. I give you the only thing you have ever truly earned. Nothing. It wasn't an insult, it was a code. Nothing was the workshop. Nothing was the invisible empire. Stephen closed the binder. The despair that had crushed him in the car was gone. The humiliation of the funeral felt distant, like a memory of someone else's life. He stood up, grabbing the bearer bonds and shoving them into his inside jacket pocket. He tucked the heavy leather binder under his arm. He checked his reflection in the dark window of the workshop. He was still wet, his suit was ruined, and he had dark circles under his eyes, but the man staring back looked different. The softness was gone. The hesitation was gone. He walked to the door, killing the lights and plunging the secret empire back into darkness. He stepped out into the rain, the heavy iron door clanging shut behind him. He locked it, testing the handle, and then turned toward his car. The rain was still falling, but he didn't feel the cold anymore. He took out his phone, plugging it into the car charger. As the screen lit up, a flood of notifications cascaded down. Mocking headlines, thoughts and prayers from fake friends, and a missed call from Shirley's lawyer. Stephen stared at the screen and smiled. It was a cold, terrifying smile. He wasn't going to the suburbs. He wasn't going to disappear. He was going to find a lawyer, he was going to cash a bond, and then he was going to introduce himself to the board of directors of Putman Industries, not as the son they disowned, but as the man who owned the ground they stood on. He put the car in gear. The hunt was on.
The offices of Finch, Sterling, and Hightower were located on the 42nd floor of the very skyscraper Stephen's father had built. The irony wasn't lost on Stephen as he stepped off the elevator. 2 days ago, he owned the building, or thought he did. Yesterday, he had been a homeless trespasser. Today, he was walking in to end his marriage, armed with a secret that burned in his chest like a live coal. He had used a fraction of the first bearer bond to buy a fresh suit. It wasn't bespoke, but it was sharp enough to pass inspection. He had shaved, slept in a real bed at a quiet hotel, and regained the clarity that grief had stolen from him. But as he approached the glass doors of the conference room, he slumped his shoulders, deliberately adopting the posture of the defeated man they expected to see. Inside, the atmosphere was frigid. Shirley sat at the head of the polished mahogany table, flanked by Arthur Finch and a junior associate who looked terrified to be breathing the same air as her. Shirley didn't look up when Stephen entered. She was busy examining a diamond bracelet on her wrist, a piece Stephen recognized instantly. It wasn't one he had bought her. It was new. Carter's taste. "You're late," Shirley said, finally flicking her eyes toward him. Her gaze was dismissive, scanning him for signs of the destitution she felt he deserved. "I have a lunch reservation at 1. "Traffic," Stephen said softly, pulling out the chair opposite her. He kept his hands folded on the table, hiding the slight tremor of adrenaline. Arthur Finch cleared his throat, sliding a thick document across the table. "Mr. Putman, thank you for joining us. We've prepared the settlement agreement as discussed. Mrs. Putman is eager to expedite this process, and given your current financial standing, we believe this offer is generous." Stephen looked down at the paperwork. Dissolution of marriage. Irretrievable breakdown. The legal terms for a broken heart and a wasted life. "Generous?" Stephen asked, his voice low. "I'm not asking for alimony, Stephen," Shirley cut in, her tone sharp. "I'm not asking for support. I'm not even asking you to pay my legal fees, which, frankly, you couldn't afford anyway. I just want a clean break." Stephen flipped through the pages. He wasn't reading the boilerplate. He was looking for one specific clause. He found it on page 7. Article 5, Waiver of Future Claims and Discovery. Both parties generally and specifically waive any and all right, title, or interest in any property, earnings, or assets acquired by the other party from this date forward, as well as any assets currently held separately or unknown to the other party. This decree serves as a final and total separation of financial estates. It was the gold digger's insurance clause. Shirley wanted to make sure that when she married Carter and accessed the Putman fortune through him, Stephen couldn't come crawling back asking for a handout. She was protecting her future wealth from his present poverty. She had no idea she was protecting his billions from her greed. "This clause," Stephen said, tapping the paper, "it says I have no claim to anything you acquire, and you have no claim to anything I have." Shirley let out a short, cruel laugh. "Stephen, be serious. What do you have? A rusted car and a dollar bill? I'm doing you a favor. If I didn't include that, my lawyers would be obligated to attach your debt to my credit score. I'm cutting you loose. You should be thanking me." Arthur Finch leaned forward, his smile oily. "It's a standard walk-away agreement, Stephen. A clean slate. You leave with your debts and your personal effects. Shirley leaves with her assets and no liability for your situation. It's the best deal you're going to get." Stephen looked at Shirley. He studied her face, the beautiful, cold features he had once adored. He remembered the way she had looked at the funeral, conspiring with his enemies. He remembered the eviction threat. "You really believe I have nothing?" Stephen said. It wasn't a question. "I know you have nothing," Shirley replied, leaning in, her eyes hard. "James made sure of that. The whole world knows it. Stop stalling. Sign the papers so we can both move on to where we belong. I belong at the top, Stephen, and you, well, you'll find your level." She slid a heavy fountain pen across the table. It spun on the polished wood and came to a stop in front of him. Stephen picked up the pen. It felt heavy, substantial. He looked at the signature line. Stephen James Putman. If he signed this, she was gone. No coming back. No claims on the Phoenix Holding Group. No rights to the patent royalties that were currently accumulating in accounts she didn't know existed. She was voluntarily signing away her share of a multi-billion-dollar estate because she was too arrogant to imagine he could be anything other than a failure. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, letting them sweat. Finch shifted in his seat. Shirley drummed her fingernails on the table. "Does it hurt?" Stephen asked quietly. "Does what hurt?" Shirley snapped. "Does it underestimate me?" Shirley rolled her eyes. "Oh, spare me the dramatic exit line. Just sign the damn paper." Stephen uncapped the pen. He didn't scribble. He signed his name with a flourish, deliberate and bold. Stephen James Putman. He dated it. He pushed the document back across the table. Finch snatched it up immediately, checking the signature like a vulture inspecting a carcass.
Everything appears to be in order. I'll file this with the court this afternoon. The divorce will be finalized within 24 hours. Shirley stood up, smoothing her skirt. She looked relieved, lighter, as if she had scraped something unpleasant off her shoe. She grabbed her purse and the new diamond bracelet caught the light, sparkling aggressively. "Goodbye, Stephen," she said, not looking at him. "I'd wish you luck, but we both know luck is for people who take action. Try not to starve." She turned and walked toward the door, her heels clicking a rhythm of victory. Finch followed her, already on his phone, likely texting Carter that the nuisance had been dealt with. Stephen remained seated. He capped the pen and placed it precisely in the center of the table. He watched them leave, watched the heavy glass doors swing shut, sealing him off from his past life. The silence returned to the conference room, but it wasn't the silence of defeat. Stephen loosened his tie. He felt a strange sensation in his chest. It was the absence of weight, the burden of trying to please a wife who despised him, the burden of his father's perceived disappointment. It was all gone. He picked up his copy of the settlement agreement. He stared at the waiver clause one last time. A slow, stoic smile spread across his face. It wasn't a smile of joy. It was the cold, thin smile of a man who watches his enemy lock themselves in a cage and throw away the key. "Luck is for people who take action," he repeated her words to the empty room. He stood up, tucked the document into his jacket next to the bearer bonds, and walked to the window. Far below, the city of Seattle sprawled out, gray and rain-swept. Somewhere down there in the port was a rusted workshop that owned it all, and somewhere in this building, a board of directors was getting ready for a meeting they thought would be a celebration. Stephen checked his watch. He had a lot of work to do before the market opened. He turned and walked out of the office, leaving the pen and his marriage on the table.
The Sapphire Lounge sat atop the precipice of the city's skyline. A glass-walled aquarium for the ultra-wealthy where the air was filtered, the champagne was vintage, and the morality was non-existent. It was the kind of place where deals were toasted in hushed corners and the music was loud enough to drown out the conscience. Shirley moved through the crowd with the grace of a jungle cat that had just taken down a gazelle. She wore a dress of crimson silk that clung to her like a second skin, a deliberate, violent splash of color amidst the sea of black tuxedos and cocktail dresses. On her wrist, the diamond bracelet Carter had given her caught the strobe lights, fracturing the beam into 1,000 tiny shards of ice. She felt lighter than she had in years. The ink on the settlement agreement was barely dry, filed electronically by Arthur Finch mere hours ago. The Stephen problem was officially resolved. She was no longer the wife of the disappointment. She was the consort of the king. Carter Thorne sat in the center of the VIP booth, his legs sprawled open in a posture of absolute dominance. He held a crystal flute of Dom Perignon loosely in one hand, his other arm draped over the back of the velvet banquette. He was laughing at something a junior board member was saying, a sharp barking sound that lacked any real warmth. When he saw Shirley approach, his eyes darkened with possession. He didn't stand up. He simply extended a hand and she took it, sliding into the seat beside him as if it were a throne she had been born to occupy. "There she is," Carter announced, his voice carrying over the thumping bass of the house music. "The woman of the hour. Or should I say, the liberated woman." The table erupted in polite, sycophantic laughter. These were the hangers-on, the social climbers, and the sharks who smelled blood in the water. They knew the hierarchy had shifted. Stephen was out, Carter was in, and loyalty in this room was as fluid as the vodka. "Liberated is the right word," Shirley purred, leaning into Carter's shoulder. She took a sip from his glass, leaving a smudge of red lipstick on the rim. "I feel like I've been holding my breath for 5 years and I finally exhaled." "To fresh air," Carter toasted, raising the glass, "and to discarding dead weight." "To the $1 man," someone shouted from the end of the table. The laughter was louder this time, cruel and raucous. Shirley joined in, a giggle bubbling up that felt like champagne fizz. "Oh, stop," she said, feigning sympathy. "I mean, imagine being given everything, the name, the education, the connections, and ending up with less than the valet Parker downstairs." "It's not tragic, Shirl. It's natural selection," Carter said, his expression hardening into a smirk.
James knew it. That's why he let me onto the board. He knew Stephen was a sheep in a world of wolves. He needed someone to protect the legacy, or rather, someone to take it over and actually do something with it. He turned to Shirley, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw. Did he cry when he signed the papers? Shirley rolled her eyes. He did this whole brooding act. Does it hurt to underestimate me, or something ridiculous like that? He actually thinks he's going to bounce back. Carter snorted into his drink. Bounce back with what? His charm? The man has the charisma of a wet paper towel. He waived his rights to everything, didn't he? You're sure? Article V, Shirley recited, the legal clause tasting sweeter than the wine. Total waiver of future claims. Whatever he finds, whatever he earns, whatever penny he scrapes off the sidewalk, it's his problem. And whatever we build, he can't touch. Perfect, Carter said. He set the glass down and leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that drew the table in. Because tomorrow, things change. The board meeting is at 9 a.m. We're voting to restructure. We're going to liquidate the charitable trust assets and reinvest in high-yield tech futures. Putman Industries has been stagnant for a decade because James was too sentimental about his legacy. I'm going to strip it down, lean it out, and double the stock price by Christmas. And the employees? The junior associate asked nervously. Collateral damage, Carter shrugged. Efficiency requires sacrifice. James is gone. The old guard is gone. It's my company now. He squeezed Shirley's thigh, his grip tight and possessive. Shirley felt a thrill of pure adrenaline. This was what she had wanted, not the quiet, boring nights with Stephen who wanted to talk about ethical business and responsibility. She wanted this, the raw power, the ruthlessness, the feeling of being untouchable. She looked out the panoramic window at the city lights sprawling below. Somewhere down there, in the rain and the filth, Stephen was probably sleeping in his car or maybe counting his change for a burger. She felt a flicker of pity, but she extinguished it instantly. He had his chance. He had been born on third base and thought he hit a triple. She had merely corrected the error. To the future, Shirley whispered, raising her own glass. To the takeover, Carter corrected, clinking his crystal against hers. The sound rang out clear and sharp, like a bell tolling. They drank deep, lost in the intoxication of their own hubris. They didn't see the storm clouds gathering over the harbor. They didn't know about the rusted key or the workshop or the documents that predated their arrogance. They sat in their glass tower, mocking the man they thought was buried, completely unaware that they were celebrating on the eve of their own execution. As the DJ transitioned to a heavier driving beat, Carter stood up, pulling Shirley with him toward the dance floor. "Come on," he shouted over the noise. "Let's show them what winners look like." Shirley laughed, throwing her head back, letting the lights wash over her. She felt invincible. She felt safe. She had no idea that the man she had discarded was currently sitting in a hotel room 5 miles away, reviewing the bylaws of Phoenix Holding Group and preparing to turn off the lights on her party forever.
The boardroom of Putman Industries was a fortress of glass and steel, suspended 50 stories above the Seattle streets. Inside, the air was conditioned to a crisp 68 degrees, smelling faintly of espresso and expensive cologne. The board of directors sat around the massive oval table, a collection of nervous men and women waiting for the inevitable. At the head of the table sat Carter Thorne. He didn't just sit, he sprawled, his jacket unbuttoned, exuding the relaxed arrogance of a man who had already won. Standing just behind his right shoulder was Shirley, dressed in a sharp white power suit, playing the role of the loyal consort to perfection. She scanned the room with a predator's gaze, ensuring every eye was fixed on the new king. "Gentlemen and ladies," Carter began, his voice smooth and projecting to the back of the room, "we are here to formalize the transition. The era of sentimental management is over. James Putman was a visionary, yes, but he was soft. He let this company bloat. Today, we trim the fat. Today, we vote to confirm me as CEO and chairman, and we begin the liquidation of the legacy assets." A murmur of assent rippled through the room. They were sheep, and Carter was the wolf they had decided to follow. All in favor? Carter asked, raising his hand, a smirk playing on his lips. Hands began to rise, one by one. Bang. The heavy double doors at the far end of the room flew open, slamming against the mahogany paneling with a violence that made half the board junk. Carter froze, his hand still in the air. Shirley gasped, clutching the back of Carter's chair. Stephen Putman walked in. He wasn't wearing the wrinkled suit from the funeral. He was wearing a fresh, charcoal gray suit, tailored and sharp. He didn't look tired, he didn't look broken. He walked with a terrifying, rhythmic calm, carrying a thick leather binder under one arm and a single sheet of paper in his hand. "Security," Carter barked, standing up. "Who let him in? Get him out of here." "Sit down, Carter," Stephen said. His voice wasn't loud, but it had a density that swallowed the room's oxygen. He didn't stop walking until he reached the opposite end of the table, staring directly down the long axis at his rival. "This is a private meeting for shareholders and board members," Shirley hissed, stepping forward, her face twisting in annoyance. "You have no business here, Stephen. You signed the settlement. You have nothing. Please don't embarrass yourself further." "I signed the settlement, yes," Stephen said, placing the leather binder on the table with a heavy thud. "And I waived my rights to anything you acquired, but I didn't waive my rights to what I already owned." "You own a dollar bill," Carter laughed, looking around the room for support. "Go buy a soda and get out." Stephen ignored him. He looked at Arthur Finch, the family lawyer, who was sitting near the front, looking pale. "Mr. Finch, you're a student of corporate law. Why don't you tell the board what the Phoenix Holding Group is?" Finch hesitated. He looked at Carter, then at the binder. His hands shook slightly as he opened it. The room went dead silent. Finch flipped a page, then another. His eyes widened behind his wire-rimmed glasses. The blood drained from his face so fast he looked like he might faint. "Well," Carter snapped, "what is it, some shell company?" It's the parent company," Finch whispered, his voice trembling. "Speak up, Arthur," Shirley demanded. Arthur looked up, terror in his eyes. "Phoenix Holding Group owns the intellectual property, all of it. The turbine designs, the logistical software, the brand name, even the lease on this building." He looked at Carter. "Putman Industries, the company we're sitting in, is just a licensee. We don't own the tech, we just rent it." Carter frowned, the smirk faltering. "So what? We pay the license fee. It's a bookkeeping trick." "Not exactly," Stephen said. He held up the single sheet of paper in his hand. "The master licensing agreement has a termination clause, Article 14. In the event of a change in management, specifically a hostile takeover by the board, the licensor has the right to revoke all usage rights immediately." Stephen dropped the paper onto the table. "I am the sole beneficiary and owner of Phoenix Holding Group, and as of this morning, I have revoked the license." "You can't do that," Carter sputtered, his face turning a mottled red. "That would shut down operations, the factories, the ships." "They stop today," Stephen said cold. "Unless, of course, the board decides to remove the cause of the breach." Stephen leaned forward, placing his hands on the table. "Here is the new deal. Putman Industries can continue to use my patents, but the price is the immediate resignation of the current interim CEO. He pointed a finger at Carter. "You're fired." The room erupted. Carter looked around wildly. "This is insane. You can't listen to him. I control the voting shares." "You control a company that is worth zero without my engines," Stephen countered. He looked at the board members. "You have 5 minutes to decide. Stick with Carter and I plug the plug. Putman stock hits zero by lunch. Or vote him out, reinstate me as executive chairman, and we keep the lights on." It didn't take 5 minutes. It took 5 seconds. "I move to remove Carter Thorne," a board member shouted from the back. "Seconded," screamed another. "All in favor?" Finch asked quickly. Every hand in the room went up. Carter stood there, stunned, his mouth opening and closing like a fish on a dock. The power he had clawed for, the coup he had orchestrated, it had evaporated in an instant. He looked at Shirley, desperate for an ally.
Shirley was staring at Stephen. Her eyes were wide, calculating, the wheels spinning frantically in her head. She saw the shift. She saw the power transfer. She realized with a sickening lurch that the man she had called a failure was now the most powerful man in the city. She stepped away from Carter. A small, tentative smile formed on her lips, the same smile she used to give Stephen when she wanted him to buy her jewelry. "Stephen," she said, her voice dropping to a sultry purr. "Honey, we can fix this. The divorce, it was a mistake. I was confused, I was grieving, but we can tear up those papers. We can run this together, just like we always planned." She reached out to touch his arm. Stephen didn't flinch. He didn't pull away. He simply looked at her hand, then up at her face, with eyes as cold as the bottom of the Puget Sound. "You're right, Shirley," Stephen said softly. "The papers are effective immediately." He reached into his pocket and pulled out the settlement agreement, the one she had forced him to sign hours ago. He held it up. Article 5. Both parties specifically waive any and all right, title, or interest in any assets acquired by the other party from this date forward. He smiled. "You wanted a clean break. You wanted to protect your future from my debt. Instead, you protected my billions from your greed." Shirley froze. The realization hit her like a physical blow. She had signed it away, all of it. She had divorced a billionaire to marry a man who was currently being escorted out of the building by security. "Stephen, please," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I need security." "Then get a job," Stephen said. He turned to the security guards who had entered the room. "Escort Mr. Thorne and his guest out of the building and revoke their clearance permanently." "Stephen," Shirley screamed as the guard took her arm. "You can't do this. I'm your wife." "You're my ex-wife," Stephen corrected, "and you're trespassing." He turned his back on them. He didn't watch as Carter was dragged out, cursing and spitting. He didn't watch as Shirley was led away, weeping not for lost love, but for lost money. Stephen walked to the head of the table, his father's chair. He sat down. The leather was worn, comfortable. He looked out at the silent, terrified board of directors. "Now," Stephen said, opening the Phoenix binder, "let's get to work."